Buffalo's staff who are out in almost full force tonight to help us record this. So I'm very thankful to them, to the Pastor Ken Hughes for being here to help us record these talks and hopefully make them available soon in an archive for you to access and share with your friends. With that, I would like to, and of course, how could I forget them? Huge thank you to John Fagant and our second speaker, Debra Hall-Stonish. Our docents, as I'm sure you know, do all of the research that goes into these talks, put their PowerPoints together, practice like crazy, so we're really grateful for all of the work that they do. So with that, I would like to introduce our second speaker, Debra Hall-Stonish. She is a founding member of Explore Buffalo. She served on our board as the treasurer for a period of time. She's also written several tours. She's written various talks for us. If you're a longtime participant in the speaker series, I'm sure you've seen her present before. So she is a whirlwind of history of Buffalo knowledge. And this, I believe, is one of her favorite topics to speak on. So I am very excited to welcome Debra Hall-Stonish.
Thank you, Paige. Well, the reason why I find this topic very interesting is because I worked in banking. I was just talking to one of our attendees here about the banks that he had worked for in Western New York. My banking experience started in actually when I was in college, so it would be about 1972 through 1990 when I became a corporate refugee. So I have some personal experience with some of the mergers and stuff that took place, but I was very interested in, well, how did it all start here in Buffalo? So my talk is going to go right back to the beginning of the village of Buffalo, when the banks start. I'm going to go chronologically through and talk about individuals who had an impact not just locally, but on the national scene as well. You might be surprised that some of the things that happened on the national level actually were from individuals who were born here in Buffalo, New York. Now, when I reviewed this with Paige, and I was finished, she says, wow, she says, I thought this was going to be really boring. So I'm hoping that you have the same reaction that, wow, I thought that was going to be really boring, but it isn't. So, without much further ado, the second part of the presentation will talk about specific institutions, the major ones. I can't cover every bank because some were in and out on very short periods of time. So I'm going to talk about the ones that you're probably going to be most familiar with and then carry through their history, and that will be the second part of the talk. So, beginning with Buffalo. The very first bank that was established was the Niagara Bank in 1816. It lasted for 20 years when it's lost its charter. So many of the banks, as I said, were established, accomplished their purpose, and then they went out of business if they didn't receive another charter. And you can see that the village of Buffalo was pretty sparsely populated, but certainly sufficient to have a bank established. In 1825, you're all aware, the Erie Canal opened, and that is when the growth began and when Buffalo started to be an economic powerhouse as far as the nation was concerned. I'm going to track the population so you can see how it grew and also where it ranked in terms of its size amongst the cities of the nation. By the time the Erie Canal opened, there were only a few thousand people here. Now, why do I have Millard Fillmore? Because he was involved in John's talk. But Millard Fillmore, at the age of 28, was elected to the state assembly. I like this picture because we're always used to seeing him with his silver hair, very handsome man, but he was really quite the dude when he was young as well. So, when he went to the assembly in New York State, one of the issues that was very near and dear to his heart was to abolish debtors' prisons. He came from a fairly poverty-stricken family. He had a tough existence. He was actually loaned out as an indentured worker and took a loan to buy his freedom and go back to his family. But they ended up coming here to East Aurora, and then he lived here the rest of his life in this area. So I always thought debtor's prison was a really stupid concept, because if you owe money and then you're put in prison, how do you earn your way out of the debt that you owe? It's just really stupid. But anyway, he thought so too. In 1832, Buffalo incorporates. We now have 10,000 people, and we are the 27th largest city in the country, and you can see, you're starting to see development of the roads in downtown Buffalo. Now I'm going to weave a story here. There's several people who are involved in the confluence of events that happened that resulted in the Panic of 1837. Some of them are local, some are not. But Nicholas Biddle was from Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and he became the president of the Second Bank of the United States. Can any of you tell me who created the first Bank of the United States? This is a federal bank, a national bank. Alexander Hamilton, for whom I would bear his children. I love him. Anyway, so that charter was lost. It was a number of years before they got another second national bank established. And in 1829, this is 4 years after the Erie Canal is open, Buffalo is actually large enough to have a branch of the Second Bank of the United States where Biddle was still the president. So keep him in mind. He's one of the first players that we're going to see in this story. The second one, Hiram Pratt. I like this portrait. If you can look this hot in a portrait from the early 19th century, you must have been really hot. But anyway, in 1831, he opens a bank. He is the cashier, the founder, president, and he also was a mayor of Buffalo at times when there were one-year terms to be mayor. So he was a mover and shaker. He was only 31 when he opened this bank. He was born in 1800, and his parents came here from Vermont. Keep him in mind. Third personality was Benjamin Rathbun. Have any of you ever heard this name? A number of you who are historians of Buffalo would know this. He was a significant businessman here in the city of Buffalo, quite the developer, land speculator. He owned brickyards, stone quarries, lumber yards. He had a hotel, stagecoach line, you name it. One year he built almost 100 buildings in the city of Buffalo. So he actually created the city as far as a landscape that you would recognize a city having. Pardon? Pickle factory? I doubt it. He was really into the building trades. Yeah, and this is the only drawing I've ever found of Benjamin Rathbun, so he's not a very pleasant-looking fellow. He employed about 2,500 people in the city of Buffalo, and that's quite a significant employment level, so he was quite well loved by the people that worked for him in his various businesses. In 1833, he opens his own free bank. It's called a free bank because it is free of any kind of regulations. You pretty much could issue notes, supposedly backed by the deposits of gold and silver that you had in the bank. So if they presented these notes to you, you should be able to give them coin in gold and silver that is representative of those notes. But you're pretty much on your own. The federal government did not print money at this time. And here's an example of some of the notes. If you look, you'll see his signature. All right, do I got this going? Right here, B. Rathbun. And I have some of the others. I like the 12.5-cent ones. Those are for the big spenders, so that they could use these and then buy goods and services, and then whoever they bought it from would turn these into the bank and get the gold and silver if they chose to do so. So now we've got another personality, and you're thinking, Andrew Jackson, what the hell does he have to do with Buffalo? Well, Andrew Jackson really hated the Second Bank of the United States. He hated having a federal bank, and he actually was in favor of state banks and took money deposits out of the Second Bank of the United States, deposited it into the state banks. But then it started to be a problem because they were issuing notes to a point that they weren't really backed by the gold and silver that they had in the banks. That caused devaluation of the notes. He wasn't happy about that. At the time, there was a lot of land speculation going on, a lot of land speculation in Buffalo. And he issued in 1836 this specie circular. And basically what it said is, you could no longer buy land by giving a note that supposedly was backed by gold and silver at the bank that you were presenting it from. You had to actually give gold or silver in order to buy this. Well, let's go back to Benjamin Rathbun. He was really speculating quite a bit in land. He was issuing notes left and right, and when this specie circular was issued, he really started to run into a lot of problems because he didn't have gold and silver to back up all the notes that he had written. So what he started to do was a kiting scheme, I would call that in current vernacular. Can't kite anymore. But you would write a note, and then it would have to be presented to the bank that it was written on to order to get your gold and silver. Well, it's pretty tough if you write it on a bank in Philadelphia and you're from Buffalo. It takes time for it to get there, and by that time, you might have deposited the money there and issued a check at another bank. So it's kind of like musical chairs. And if you're the last chair and you lose, well, you lose. So what he started to do is to issue promissory notes to the tune of $1.5 million with the forged signatures of very affluent citizens of the city of Buffalo. Now, one of them happened to come across one of these notes, and he said, "I've never signed this. What's with this?" And that started the whole chain reaction, where it then came out that these were all forged notes. Well, you started in Buffalo for people who had these notes that were of no use or value anymore, and you started the Panic of 1837, which was really started by Andrew Jackson because of the Specie Circular, started here in Buffalo in 1836 because of Benjamin Rathbun. $1.5 million is a hell of a lot of money in 1836. So this is actually artwork where it says, "Stave off the fall. Dare not let him break. It would ruin the whole place." And in fact, it really did quite a bit of damage to the city of Buffalo. So that's a confluence of all those individuals reenacted here for what happened in Buffalo. So now we're getting into the 1840s. Buffalo is the 22nd largest city. And why do I have a picture of the Lockport locks? Well, in 1844, Lockport was now becoming a fairly a strong economy in and of its own, never really equaled Buffalo. But they established a bank there in 1844 to deal with all of the commerce that was flowing through Lockport. This is 2 years before Buffalo Savings Bank was established. And then Buffalo Savings Bank in 1846 was established. Millard Fillmore was one of the founding trustees. So he kind of weaves his way through the stories of both John and me. Now in the 1850s, Buffalo is the 16th largest city. 1851, Western Savings Bank is formed. How many of you remember Western Savings Bank? Yeah, you're going to have gray hair. Mine's colored, by the way, I do have it. In 54, you have Erie County Savings Bank established. And then you have M&T Bank, Manufacturers and Traders, that was established in 1856. I will get into the history of each of these individual banks in the second half of my presentation. I wanted to talk about individuals who had an impact on the national level. William Fargo became a freight agent in 1841. He was around Syracuse and Auburn, worked for a railroad company doing express service, messenger service. Came to Buffalo in 1843 as a resident agent, and then went to work for a company where he eventually partnered with Henry Wells, one of the owners of that company. And in 1845, they partnered to form the Western Express, which provided service between Buffalo and Chicago. So this is how he started to get into the business. Now this actually forks off into two directions, what William Fargo did. In 1850, they formed the American Express Company, and that is a stock share, which is from that company. In 1857, they start to produce money orders that really competed with the U.S. postal money orders, which you can still get today. And then in 1891, this is 10 years after William Fargo died, he died in 1881, they established the traveler's check. How many of you remember using traveler's checks throughout your life at some point? And I remember American Express had this advertising that said, you know, just keep a $100 traveler's check in your wallet just in case you need it. And I'm thinking, wow, genius, because they're making money on the float. I mean, you do know how traveler's checks work. You pay your $100, they hold on to it, and then they pay it out when you turn it in. But if you never turn it in, then they have that $100 that they can invest and do whatever they want with. Oh well, I digress. Now, at the same time, a few years later, they created another express company called Wells Fargo and Company that would facilitate services even further to San Francisco. And then they added banking services to the services that they provided with the messenger service or the express service that they had. In the 1900s, they broke these two services off, the express service and the banking service. So when you hear about Wells Fargo Bank, that is part of William Fargo and what he started here with his partner Henry Wells. So it has a Buffalo initiation here in Buffalo for what became national. Now getting into the 1860s, Buffalo is now the 10th largest city. And you can see how the waterfront is developing there with the Central Wharf and all of the commercial buildings that you have. Another individual from Buffalo, Elbridge Jerry Spalding. He was a mayor, he was a treasurer of New York State, and then he was elected to the House of Representatives. And take a look at when he was elected. What was going on at the time? Civil War. Well, he is known as the father of the greenback. He was chairman of the House and Ways Committee subcommittee in Congress, so that's the second one we had that was chairman in these presentations. And in 1862, he drafted legislation that basically said that the United States should be printing money. He knew that the government was going to run out of money to fund the Civil War. So he said what we need to do is to be able to print the money, and this is the greenback that was printed. I chose this one because it has Alexander Hamilton, for whom I would bear his children. So it was called a greenback because the back of it was printed in green. But basically, this is the beginning of the American dollar that the federal government printed. And it was backed by the faith in the US government, not particularly gold or silver that they had on reserve. Could cause some problems there, don't you think? He's on the $10 bill, Alexander Hamilton. Now, another thing that happened coming out of this is that there were banks that were allowed to print their own notes. And when I do the Lockport tour, there is the Niagara County National Bank that was established there in 1864. And they would print notes, and here is an example of a note that's got Niagara County National Bank. It is supported by the government. So you're basically, it's like a bond that you're buying. And between the time that it began, the bank began, and within 70 years, they had issued around $8 million of these notes. But Niagara County National Bank was not the only one that was doing this. There were banks around the country that were doing this. But this is a result of Elbridge Jerry Spalding and his idea of how to fund the Civil War. Now we get to the 1870s and 80s. Buffalo's population, I put it down as 160,000 rather than their ranking because they actually kind of lost. They kind of dropped down where they were, instead of 10th, they went down to like 11th and 15th. So I'm like, oh, I'm not going to show you that. I'm just going to show you the population. We have Farmers and Mechanics Bank, started in Lockport in 1870. I will talk about the detail of that bank in the second half. And then you had the German American Bank established in 1882. I'll talk about them in detail too when we get to that section. Now here's another individual. And you'd think, well, Grover Cleveland, what the hell does he have to do with finance? Well, a few weeks before he was sworn into office for his second term in January of 1893, there was a major, we call it today depression, but it was a panic. And it started with a failure of a major railroad company. And there was a domino effect. You had businesses failing, you had banks that were failing, and people who were unemployed. You had prices that were depressed for the farmers, which meant that they didn't get the money to pay their debts, and then they lost their farms. Does this sound familiar? Because this happened to us in 1980s. So it just cycles through all the time. Now, Grover Cleveland blamed this on the 1890 Silver Purchase Act that was renewed and signed into law under his predecessor, Benjamin Harrison. And basically what it allowed was that you didn't just have gold backing currency, you had silver backing the currency. Now silver is much more plentiful than gold. And so they were over mining in the Southwest. And when you over mine, you are going to devalue the currency because the supply is so much. It also required the United States government to buy every month $4.5 million of silver. So Grover Cleveland blamed the devaluation and the problems they were having on this. I think it was really not quite the case, but makes for a good story to always blame it on your predecessor. So what he did was to repeal that act and go back on the gold standard. In fact, they were doing this in Europe at the time, where they were not allowing any other kind of metal to support or back their currency. So he went back to the gold standard. So when you hear the gold standard as being like the highest level that you can be compared to, it's basically because gold is backing the currency. In the 1900s, we all know this, Buffalo was the 8th largest city. And I have this here, the Pan American was in 1901. And the Bank of Buffalo was established. This is different from the one that was established by, obviously, Hiram Pratt, that really hot-looking guy. And the Federal Reserve Bank recognized that Buffalo was sufficiently large enough and an economic force to establish a branch here to be able to support the banking operations that we had here with the cash supply and being able to move that around. So this is the timeline of events that I'm talking about. I'm going to talk now about the specific institutions and carry them through into today as far as the mergers and acquisitions and things that took place with them. Again, I'm only talking about the major ones. So, first one is Buffalo Savings Bank in the timeline. They were established in 1846. As I said, Millard Fillmore was one of the founding trustees. And Robert Pomeroy was their only employee, and he was the one who had the first account there. So he had a very vested interest in the bank surviving because he was the only employee. Within 6 months, they had $19,000 in deposits and nearly 150 depositors. Now, when I talk about savings banks, I'm going to be talking about the deposit size, because they did not lend except in mortgages, and that was later on. They collected deposits. Commercial banks were the ones who had the checking accounts and the loans and all of those sorts of things. They are measured in asset size. So when I talk about savings banks, it's deposit size. Now, their operating principle was to encourage the industrious and prudent, and to induce those who have not hitherto been such, to lessen their unnecessary expenses, and to save and lay by something for a period of life when they will be less able to earn a support. And I'm pretty sure when you open up your account today with the bank, they pretty much want to tell you exactly how to live your life, right? Because that's how I look at this. Anyway, savings banks usually were very short-lived, but Buffalo Savings Bank survived several panics, and they were in several locations in downtown Buffalo. I didn't want to go into each one. But the most important one in 1901 that we recognize is when they built this on the corner of Huron and Main Street. And you'll notice in this that there are a lot of, where's my thing? Right here, these were stores and buildings that butted right up to the bank. So you didn't have a continuation of these arched windows on the other side because they actually were covered by a building being there. And you'll notice that the dome is copper clad. It is not gold. At one point in 1907, when there was concern about a run on the banks, they actually took stacks of cash and put them in the window so that people would see, oh no, we have cash in here. You don't have to worry about running in and drawing everything out of your account. I don't think that would work today. By 1933, and this is in the heart of the Depression now, they had $8 million in deposits and nearly 100,000 accounts. And in 1954, that was one of the questions or the facts that was in the beginning, is actually when they gilded the dome. and covered that copper. In the 1980s, they renamed it Gold Dome Bank. And in 1982, they added the addition. Now, if you've ever walked by there, you'll notice that this was where all those buildings were. So if you walk by there now, it's almost like a little plaza, and they have created the windows that are on the other sides of the bank. I think they've done a really fabulous job of doing that. But by 1991, they did not survive, and M&T Bank acquired all of their deposits. There was a lot of fluctuation going on in the 1980s, 90s, 80s particularly, where you had the thrift crisis. Are any of you familiar with that thrift crisis? Savings banks and savings and loan banks, where a lot of them went out. In fact, I don't even know if there are savings banks in existence today. The next major institution, Marine Bank, formed by 8 men, some of them involved in railroads in 1850. It was a state-chartered bank, so it meant that they were under state regulations, and they were capitalized with assets of $170,000. Again, this is a commercial bank, not a savings bank. And they pretty much dealt with the grain and milling industry companies who were here in Buffalo. Now, when you hear the term later, Marine Midland Bank, think of the Great Lakes, because that's Midland and Marine, and that was all the activity that was going on in the Great Lakes. That's where it got its name. In 1904, George Rand Sr. Becomes president, and there are quite a few mergers that take place. They acquired banks, and so they got a lot bigger, built a new building that is the Marine Trust building that we know of today, and changed their name to the Marine Trust Company. So they now had a trust division as part of the organization. Well, George Rand Sr. dies. George Rand Jr. takes over in 1926, a very young man when he becomes president of the Marine Trust Company. I think he's also pretty hot. So, in 1929, it becomes the Marine Midland Bank Corporation. And they are the very first bank holding company in the nation. What do I mean by that? They had affiliated 17 banks that were separate banks throughout New York State. You could only do it within a state. There was no interstate banking at the time. So you had banks in Elmira, and Albany, and Poughkeepsie, Rochester, and in other little towns in between, Schenectady, et cetera, and they would have been self-contained banks, but they were now under the banner of Marine Midland Bank, even though they had started out their life as an independent bank. Also in 1929, they start the building of a new building. The Rand building, the original design was supposed to be 2 towers. But because of the stock market crash, they really did not have sufficient financing to do the original design, so they only have 1 tower today, which is still there today. In 72, they construct the Seneca Tower. That's at the foot of Main Street. It's not a great picture, but I like the fact that you can see Main Street going underneath the building. It's the only picture I could find like that. In 1980, they become Marine Midland Bank N.A. What does that mean? It means a national association. Marine Midland Bank was a state bank, and they were governed by the superintendent of banking in New York State, Muriel Siebert. Now, they were looking to be acquired by Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation. British-owned bank based in Hong Kong and Shanghai, and they were looking for an escape route out of the Pacific Rim when Hong Kong was going to transfer to China. And they weren't really sure how that transfer was going to go, if they needed to get a jettison out, so they bought 50% share in Marine Midland Bank, which was a regional retail banking powerhouse. Retail banking is more branch banking, and so that's what they did. In 1987, they increased the share to 51%, and that's when they changed the name to HSBC Bank. Now, when they did the end run, when they became a national association, they were no longer under the jurisdiction of Muriel Siebert and the New York State superintendent. They were now national, so the merger went through. But they made a decision in 2012 that they were going to get rid of all of their retail banking operations. They still exist as a commercial bank powerhouse, and we're talking big, really big. Marine Midland Bank, doing commercial lending, was at best third in line as far as providing loans. So they sold off all of their branches throughout New York State. Next one is Western Savings Bank. They were the second savings bank to open. The first one was Buffalo Savings Bank in 1846. And their office was pretty much near where the Marine Trust building is today. And you can see how quickly they grew in terms of the deposits that they were collecting. In 1872, they moved to Court and Main Street. I like this building because I like the logo that they have, the name of the bank. That's right here. It's a pretty cool building. But in 1964, they decided to construct this 12-story tower that is still there today. They were one of the very first banks locally to computerize. And I was a teller in the 1970s, and there wasn't a lot of automation going on, not much computer work. But as happened with a lot of the banks, you had a series of mergers with other banks and acquisitions by other banks, and this one first merged with Niagara County Savings and Loan, and then merged with Buffalo Savings Bank, so it basically does not exist anymore. It didn't exist after they merged with Niagara County Savings and Loan. Erie County Savings Bank, they were formed quite early on, and they allowed you had to have $1 to open an account. So what they would give you is this little card that you could put your dimes in, so that when you got up to 10 dimes, you turned the 10 dimes in, and then you could open your account. So that was their 10-cent system. Now they moved to Main and Erie Streets. That's when Erie actually continued on to Main as one of the radials. And during the Civil War, they had as much as $2.5 million in deposits. That's pretty large. In 1889, they moved to Main and Church. This is the time that this church, First Presbyterian Church, decided to move further out. So the land was available there to build Shelton Square, and that was completed in 1893. What I like about this photograph is you can see Erie County Savings Bank right here. But unfortunately, urban renewal, we took Shelton Square down and built this lovely architecturally significant structure, at the Main Places Tower. I'm sorry, do any of you here like it? Anyway, so they renamed the bank in 1977, took out county out of it, called it Erie Savings Bank. So now we're getting into really more my history of what I remember. And then they renamed it Empire of America. Remember everybody calling it the Big E? Well, here's what happened to them. They went through a lot of mergers and acquisitions, bought a lot of little savings and loans and savings banks, and they had an asset on their books called goodwill. It's kind of like a fudge factor. It doesn't really mean anything. But they had gotten it up to $1 billion after all of these mergers because they absorbed the goodwill from all of the other banks. And the Resolution Trust Company, who was dealing with the thrift crisis at the time, they changed the rules and said, you can't use that as an asset anymore. So they were undercapitalized, and therefore they were ready to go under. So they sold off all their branches, and Key Bank and M&T Bank bought them all. And this is around 1990. So bye-bye, the Big E. Manufacturers and Traders Bank. They were established in 1956. Pascal Pratt, he is the nephew of Hiram Pratt. Remember that really hot dude that I told you that formed the bank in 1831? Yeah. And Bronson Rumsey. So these names are very familiar here in Buffalo. They were coming back from New York City on a trip and basically complaining that there wasn't sufficient banking to provide the capital that was needed for the growth and the businesses that were here in Buffalo. You'll see that this is about 30 years after the opening of the Erie Canal, and growth was quite exponential at this time. So they decided to start a bank. They were incorporated with capital or assets of $200,000. That's quite a bit. And their original location was on East Swan Street. Their idea or philosophy was to provide capital essential to encourage growth of area businesses, specifically railroads and manufacturing. thus the name manufacturers and traders. Now, in 1901, they moved to Main and Swan Street. And the building on the left was designed by E.V. Green. And then they expanded it, and you might be able to make out that this building is actually in here. So they built this building around it, and this is at Main and Swan. Do you remember Main and Swan? It's not there anymore. Anyway, they went through a series of mergers as well, bought some fairly significant sized banks, so that eventually their asset size got to be about $134 million, and this would have been just prior to the stock market crash. And they decided in 1928, because this is one of the banks that they bought, Fidelity Trust Company, that they're going to move across the street from where they built that columned building to the Fidelity Trust Bank building, which is now the Department of Labor today, if you're familiar with where that is on Main Street. So they move across the street. And then in 1964, I love this photograph, they decide to build One M&T Plaza. And this is what that plot of land looked like before they tore the buildings down. And you'll see AM&A's right here. So this is AM&A's. So this is what they tore down. This is the plot of land that they used to build this. And this they moved into in 1960. Is this still working? In the 90s, they began expansions into several states, because now you could do interstate banking. You were not limited to just New York State. You could move across, so they're in Maryland, and they're in Virginia. I know they're all in D.C. area. Delaware, Maryland, so they're in that corridor there. And I only had access to their 2017 statements, and that was about $120 billion at that point. Significant size. Farmers and Mechanics Bank, I had mentioned them earlier, starting in 1870. They were established in Lockport, and in 1906 they built this building, which is still there. Unfortunately, it's vacant and it is deteriorating. I really wish they would find a tenant for it. In 1967, they renamed it Lockport Savings Bank. How many of you fondly remember Lockport Savings Bank? Then they renamed it in 2000 to First Niagara Bank. Then they decided in 2011 to purchase all those HSBC branches that they were spinning off around New York State, and they bit off more than they could chew. They expanded too rapidly, couldn't handle it, so in essence they had to sell, and they were acquired by Key Bank and a few other banks who divvied up the branches. So from 1870 till 2015, a 145-year run. German-American Bank. They set up in an office in the basement of this building at Main and Court. At this time, the population of Buffalo consisted about 60% of the population was of German descendants. So they felt that it was appropriate to have a bank where they would get deposits from German Americans and then lend it out to those German American based businesses. And they grew rather quickly, so that within 8 years they actually purchased the building that they started in the basement of. Well, there was a little bit of a conflict that happened between 1914 and 1918, and anti-German sentiment was rather high. So they made the decision in April of 1918, just as we were sending our soldiers over to fight, that they were going to change the name of the bank to the Liberty Bank. You know, they were American citizens, but to call yourself German American, you know, people were, it was wrong branding at that time. Then they constructed this building on the same lot at Main and Court, and just to punctuate the point, they put the two statues of Liberty at the top. And on this photograph, you can see the name Liberty National Bank right here. And we were talking about all the mergers, and so here's a whole bunch of bank names they're going to fly by. In the 1960s, they started to acquire branches throughout the area, and they began construction of this building at Main and West Huron, across the street from the Gold Dome Bank. This is where Grants used to be. And here's the series of acquisitions that pretty much obliterates their existence. First by North Star, then by Fleet, then by Bank of America. And Bank of America is the one who still operates those branches today. Bank of Buffalo. Now this was an interesting one. This started in 1916. It was actually called the Buffalo Morris Plan Industrial Bank. Kind of catchy. But they focused on personal business, retail business. So it would be not commercial enterprises and loans and things like that, but making personal loans to individuals. Savings certificates that we call CDs today, or certificates of deposit. How many of you remember Christmas clubs? I do. In 1929, they built this beautiful dome building right across from the Seneca Tower on the northwest corner of Seneca and Maine. And they renamed the bank the Buffalo Industrial Bank. Now, I never remember that name because I remember when they changed it to yet another time. And really, within a short period of time, they started to have more commercial business than personal business. So they got away from their first focus. In '39, they were the very first bank east of the Mississippi to have drive-through banking. Now, they promoted automobile loans to individuals, so they thought, well, you know, if we have a drive-through and we're focusing on promoting automobile loans, then maybe we could tie the two together. It's pretty good branding, especially that early on. And they claimed to be the very first ones to offer home improvement loans and student loans in Western New York. I haven't been able to verify that. They also offered overdraft protection, first time to people who had checking accounts, so that if you were not very good about watching the money in your account and you happened to overdraft, then those would not be returned for insufficient funds. In '48, they moved to Court Street in this absolutely wonderful Art Deco building and renamed it the Bank of Buffalo in 1959. I was a teller for this bank. This is where I started my first job in banking. Now, by the '70s, they allowed banks to branch statewide. In some states, they still only had unit branch banking, like in Chicago. You had one branch that you could go to for that bank, and that was it. But they started to allow banks to branch out and go across state lines. And this is when you were not a holding company like Marine Midland Bank, who had bought banks that had branches already established in those towns. And Boney, I call it that because I was in the business. It's Bank of New York. Was established by Alexander Hamilton, the one whom I would bear his children. So that was established in the 18th century. So Bank of New York bought it. And then later on, they sold it to Key Bank. Bank of New York does not exist anymore. The final bank that I'm going to be talking about is the Federal Reserve Bank. Remember I said by 1919, Buffalo was really quite the economic powerhouse, so they established a branch of the Federal Reserve Bank here in Buffalo. Well, when M&T Bank moved across the street at Main and Swan to the Fidelity Trust Bank, they sold this bank, this beautiful columned structure, to the Federal Reserve Bank. And they were here until they moved to Delaware Avenue in 1959. Now I want you to note in this picture, you'll see the eagle that's above the door here, because when they closed the Federal Reserve Bank branch in 2008, they sold it to New Era Cap Company, who added on this glass atrium, and the eagle is now here at sidewalk level. But this is from the original Federal Reserve Bank branch. So, this is basically my presentation of banking and finance, but I have a couple questions because I want to see how closely you've been listening to me. So I have some questions. What is the only bank to exist under its original name? M&T. Who is the father of the greenback? Spalding. Can you give me all three names? Jerry was the middle name, Elbridge, and at the Ellicott Complex where you have Spalding Hall, it's after him. Whose scandal was the impetus for the beginning of the Panic of 1837 in Buffalo? Rathbun, Benjamin Rathbun. And where are the columns of the M&T Bank Branch Federal Reserve Bank? UB, North Campus, LaSalle Lake? Yes, sir. And I will tell you, when I was going to UB in the 70s, all of those columns were all apart in front of Baird Hall in the parking lot. So when you tell somebody, I'll meet you by the columns, that's where they were before they actually put them up together on the North Campus. So that is my presentation. Are there any questions that you have?
So we have had a request from our sound technician if we could pass the mic so we can hear your questions. So questions.
It must have been either very thorough or extremely boring, one or the other.
Question in the back.
It's not a question, but I'm just curious.
Wait.
Don't know that I need it, but I'm just curious how many people here have worked for any of these banks.
Oh, raise your hands. How many people here have worked for banks?
I figured it had to be pretty big.
Yeah, because why the hell else would you come to this presentation? Yes.
We do, though. We do to capture it for the recording. So.
Okay, you showed early in the presentation a picture of a 12.5-cent paper bill. Since that's half of a quarter, was it referred to as 1 bit?
I don't know the answer to that question. They printed their own notes, so they did whatever they wanted as far as the notes that they were going to send out. I don't know the answer to that.
I was told that down at one of the parks, the waterfront, that there were marble columns and that it was from a bank. I'm just curious to know as to which bank it's from.
Yes, you're referring to Wilkeson Point around in there. I've heard two stories. I've heard that they are from the M&T Bank branch, and I've also heard that they're from St. Joe's new cathedral, that parts of it are put down there. So I don't really know if it's both or if it's one or the other.
I can answer the question about the bits. In the colonial era, there was specie from all over the world that was being used in America, and the Spanish coins in particular were large and could be cut into bits, into 6 bits, 2 bits, 4 bits, 6 bits a dollar. And that Spanish coin and the word for that becomes our word for dollar.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. Pieces of 8. So they would have taken the Spanish coin and cut it up. Interesting.
Any other questions? Let's give another huge round of applause to
Thank
Deb.
you.
And we will now do our drawing for the winner of the 2 admission tickets to the Bemis Ransom House Spotlight Tour on March 13th. So I will have Deb draw our lucky winner here.
And it is Alida Mamoser.
You know her? Yeah. Congratulations, Alida. So thank you all again so much for joining us tonight. We will be back here in exactly 2 weeks on March 7th. I will actually be giving a talk on the Trailblazers of Buffalo, and our second talk will be on the artistic legacy of Josef Soavinsky, whose work, he's an artist. You've probably seen his work and not realized it was him, so we'll put those puzzle pieces together for you and you'll learn about a fantastic artist in our region. Please get home safely and have a lovely night. Thank you so much.